Hello everyone and welcome back to the Betty Sew Along. Today is day 4 and we have our bodices totally finished and we're going to be working on the skirt today. So we're going to do the pockets, we're going to work on the placket, we're going to sew the skirt pieces together, we're going to assemble our ruffle, we're going to attach our ruffle, and then tomorrow we'll work on attaching it to our bodices so it's not so long of a day. So let's get started. Okay, so we're going to start working on our pockets. So you can grab your pocket pieces and your skirt pieces. The first thing I'm going to mention is if you're doing the simple skirt, you're going to take your pocket piece and place it on the edge of your skirt so that this edge lines up with the side of your skirt. And the top edge, which will be straight for you, will match up with the top of the skirt, and you're going to cut out the corner of your simple skirt. Okay, so we're going to take a lining piece. For the circle skirt it looks like this. If you have a simple skirt, it's straight across up here. And we are going to place it face down on our circle skirt, lining up that angled edge with our waist here on the skirt and the angled piece here. And we're going to go ahead and pin that. And now we'll sew across there. And just to be clear, it is the angled piece that we're sewing only. We're not sewing to the waist seam, and we are not sewing on the side of the skirt. We are only sewing along this angled piece where I have pinned here. Okay, and for construction, we're going to use a stitch length of 2, and we're going to use our 3/8 inch seam allowance. Okay, so I don't know if you can see, I've only sewn across this angled piece. Okay, so now that we have that angle sewn, what I like to do is flip this over, flip the pocket piece out, and we're going to press our seam allowance toward the pocket. Then we'll flip it back over, and we're going to top stitch the seam allowance to the pocket to keep the pocket from wanting to pop out. You can fold this pocket all the way to the back side the way it's supposed to be and press and top stitch. I like to do the understitching, so just stitching the seam allowance to the pocket, because that way you don't have any stitching showing on the outside. So I'm going to use a stitch length of 3 and a seam allowance of about 1/8 of an inch. Okay, so it looks like that. When it's done, you can see I have the stitching on the pocket side and not on the skirt side. And then we will fold it toward the back of the skirt, the wrong side of the skirt. And we're going to press that flap. I just wanted to show you, you will notice that when you flip this over to the front, up here is lined up perfectly and up here is lined up perfectly. If that's not the case for you, you need to go back and use the proper seam allowance when you sew the pocket lining onto the skirt. Okay, so now we're going to do the same thing with the other side of the front skirt and the other pocket lining. So go ahead and do that, and then I will come back and show you how to add the pocket bag. Okay, so now I have my pocket lining and I'm going to add the pocket bag. So we're going to take a pocket bag, which looks like this. It'll be straight across at the top if you have the simple skirt, and we're going to place it right sides together, the pocket pieces, not the skirt, right sides together. We're going to line up that round side and we're going to pin all the way around. We are not pinning it to the skirt, we are just pinning the two pocket pieces together. So we're pinning the pocket bag to the pocket lining. Okay, so I have my pins all the way around the round side, and it is not pinned to my skirt. I can easily move my pocket around. Okay, so now we're going to sew along that round edge that we just pinned with a 3/8 inch seam allowance once again. So we're using a stitch length of 2 because we're constructing, and a seam allowance of 3/8. You're going to tuck your skirt out of the way so you can just like fully pull out your pocket like this. Tuck that skirt away. You don't want to be sewing into the skirt at all. And there we have it. So I've sewn around that round edge. And these edges are going to be raw. So if you're not doing like French seams or anything, you're going to want to finish these edges either with a zigzag or a serger. I'm going to go ahead and use my serger. Okay, there we go. Now we're going to flip our skirt back over to the right side and line up those edges. My pocket is showing at the bottom because this is my ruffle version of the skirt. If you are not doing the ruffle version, you won't be able to see your pocket. Okay, so now I'm just going to pin over here where it's lined up at the side of the skirt. And you can baste this if you want. I'm just going to keep it pinned. And up here as well on the waist where it's lined up there. Get a couple pins in it. Okay, and that will be ready to sew into your back skirt. So you're going to do that on both sides, and then we'll be ready to put our skirt pieces together. Okay, so here we are with our front skirt complete, and we're going to take our back skirt. We will place it on top of our front skirt, matching up the side seams. So we're going to sew from the waist seam all the way down to the end of the pocket on both of these sides. Okay, so we're using a stitch length of 2 and a seam allowance of 3/8 of an inch. Okay, so I've sewn down my side seam all the way to the bottom of the pocket. Okay, so we now have our front skirt sewn to our back skirt, and you should have a big donut-shaped skirt piece like this. Okay, so the next thing we are going to do is we're going to work on our placket. So what we're going to need to do for that first is to mark your center back skirt piece. I just have it marked here with a pin. I can also see there's a fold along my back center piece. Then we are going to measure 3 inches down and mark it. So I'm going to again mark it with a pin, just like that. Then we are going to cut all the way down to our mark. Okay, so that's where our placket is going to go. Next, we're going to take our placket piece and we're going to fold one side up 1/2 inch and press. Okay, so I have my placket here. I have folded one long edge up, wrong sides together, and I've pressed it 1/2 inch. Now we're going to take the long raw edge on this side and we're going to line it up with our placket slit here. So I pin it all the way down. We're going to be using a 1/8 inch seam allowance, so I pin it all the way down to the bottom of the slit plus another 1/8 inch because you're going to sew past the end of the V about 1/8 of an inch because that's our seam allowance. Now, something worth mentioning here is if you did not cut your placket on the bias, it may be a little bit more difficult to maneuver your placket around your slit. It's definitely more ideal to have a little bit of give when you are sewing with a placket. Okay, so I'm going to sew down this side of the slit where I've pinned my placket all the way down to about 1/8 of an inch past the slit. And I'm going to, when I get to the end, I'm going to keep my needle in the down position and I'm going to pivot my placket all the way around to the other side. So I'll show you how I do that. Okay, so I have my placket pinned here. We're going to use a small stitch length, so a stitch length of 2. We're going to be working with a 1/8 inch seam allowance here. So I'm sewing all the way to that pin that marked about 1/8 of an inch past the end of my slit. I'm going to leave my needle in the down position, lift up my presser foot, and now I'm going to spin my placket around so that the edge lines up with the other side of my slit. It takes a little bit of maneuvering fabric around to get it just right. Okay, now we just need to make sure that where we had our needle in the down position actually caught the fabric, which in my case it did, thankfully. So it should look something like this when you flip it up. There's some puckering in the center there, that's fine. Now we are going to flip this back to the back side So we're taking our seam allowance from the stitch we just sewed. We are pressing it toward the placket. Then we take our folded side and match it up to that seam that we sewed. And we're going to pin that in place. And we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to sew all the way down to the V and all the way back to the point of the V and then all the way back up. Okay, so I'm going to sew all the way down right into that V. It's actually better to sew from the right side so that you know that your stitches are exactly where you want them. So again, we're using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Okay, my needle is in the down position. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to maneuver the fabric all the way around to the back side where we already sewed. We'll line this up. And we'll sew right up the other side of the packet. We'll just double check to make sure we caught the back, which we did, and that it looks nice on the front. Now when we lay our skirt out, one side is going to be flat like this, and one side is going to fold up on top of it like this. And when it's like that, it should lay pretty nice and flat. You shouldn't have too much puckering here. I do have a little bit of puckering, but probably with a good press that will not be noticeable. So there we have done our placket. Okay, so now we have our skirt complete. We're going to work on putting together the ruffles. So we can set that aside for now. And we will grab our ruffle pieces. Okay, I'm going to show you what to do with maybe with 3 of these ruffles. All we're going to do is we take 2 of our ruffle pieces and we put them right sides together. And we sew one of the short ends together. So using a stitch length of 2 for our construction and a seam allowance of 3/8, Actually, it doesn't matter about the seam allowance since it's going to be gathered. I'm just going to go straight to my serger so that I can finish those edges without having to go back to them. Because there are a lot of ruffles to sew. Okay, so I sewed those together. Now I'm going to, once again, place it right side up. Take another ruffle piece, put it together, right sides together, and sew down this edge. The reason I want to do this is because I want to make sure that all of my right sides are on the same side. I don't want to have any of my seams showing. That's especially important if you're using like a solid fabric or something that doesn't have a right side and a wrong side. You can easily get a little bit confused about which side you're sewing on. For example, if I accidentally had my wrong sides together like this seam would be visible and this seam would not. So you just want to make sure that you always have your right sides together and you're sewing the seams on the same side. Okay, and you're going to keep doing that until all of your ruffles are put together, and then you're going to sew the two ends together to make a circle. Okay, so when you are sewing your two ends together to make the loop, you want to make sure that there are no twists in your loop of ruffle pieces. So I like to just go and make sure that there are no twists at all in my ruffle pieces, and make sure I have my right sides together. Okay, so now I have this ginormous loop of ruffle pieces that we are going to sew gathering stitches through. So, to sew gathering stitches, I like to use a stitch length of 4. It's the longest one you have. And I like to mark my side seams on my ruffles because I only do gathering stitches on 1/2 at a time, so that I can gather the front and the back separately. So I'm going to go ahead and mark those. Okay, so one of my tricks for sewing gathering stitches is to buy the pre-wound embroidery thread bobbins. I find them really nice for gathering. To gather, you pull the bobbin thread, and with embroidery thread, they're really nice and silky, and so it makes it really easy for the fabric to slide along the thread when you have embroidery thread in your bobbin. So I do 2 gathering stitches because that's the way that I make really nice even gathers. So I do one at about 1/8 of an inch from the edge, and then I sew another gathering stitch beside it, about 1/2 inch beside it or so. So we don't backstitch at all. We just start and we go all the way to the other mark that we made, to the other side of the ruffle loop. So here we go. Okay, so now I'm going to go back. And I'm just going to do about a 1/2 inch on the other side of that. Okay, so that would be for either the front or the back of our dress. And now I'm going to go back to that edge where we started with the one side, right here. And I'm going to go in the other direction toward the other side. So both the threads that I pull are on the same side seam. Okay, and we're going to do that all over again. One more time. And there we have it. Okay, so we have our gathering stitches sewn, but before we start ruffling, I am going to hem my ruffle pieces. So there's a few ways you can do this. The easy way is to do a rolled hem on your serger or on your sewing machine. You can do that totally. I am going to actually hem mine, so I'm going to finish my bottom edge of my ruffle pieces with my serger, and then I'm going to press it up 1/2 inch and sew. If you aren't finishing your edges, you can just press up 1/4 inch and then press up another 1/4 inch, whatever you find is best for you. Okay, so hemming a circle skirt. If you are not doing the ruffle, this is for you. So basically, the problem with hemming a circle skirt is that the circumference of the outside of the circle is larger than anywhere you can hem it up to. So you basically, the wider the hem, the harder it is for your circle skirt to accommodate it. So the trick is to hem it only 1/2 inch or less, 1/4 or something. My favorite is to hem it up 1/2 inch. So you could do 1/4 and then another 1/4 to finish your edges. I use my serger to finish the edge of my circle skirt, and then I hem it up 1/2 inch. So I'm going to show you the way that I do it. The other thing you could do is to use pre-made bias tape as like a facing on the inside of your circle skirt. And if you don't know what I mean by that, Simple Life Pattern Company has an excellent blog post on how to do that. So I will make a note to myself to link that for you. But this is my favorite way to do it. I first go with my serger and I finish all the way around my circle skirt. So I've finished the edge of my circle skirt with my serger. And starting at a seam, I fold it up to where I want to hem it. Then I go over here and I fold it up straight, the same amount that I did over here, so that 1/2 inch. And then I kind of stretch this so that this in the middle of these 2 pins lays flat, and I pin it there. Okay, and then I just keep doing the same thing all the way around. So I do it over here, pull it up 1/2 inch, pin it, go in between these until it lays. So I kind of stretch it till it lays flat, pin it, and then when I sew it, I do stretch it ever so slightly. And that's why I say no more than 1/2 inch, because if you do any more than that, you're going to be really stretching your skirt. And at certain points in the skirt where there's no give to it when you're not on the bias, it's going to be impossible to do it this way. So I just keep going all the way around the skirt this way. Ta-da! My skirt is all pinned, and now I go to the iron and iron it all flat. And as I do that, I'm kind of sort of stretching in between my pins just so they lie flat enough to press. Okay, so once you have that all pressed, I recommend loading a bobbin with a coordinating thread and sewing from the wrong side of your skirt to hem it. I like doing this because I can make sure that I'm right along the edge of my hem, because if you sew closer to the fold of your hem, it tends to flip out. If you sew right at that edge, I find it flips out less. So I'm just going to change my bobbin out for that purple that I want to hem with. So we're going with a length of 3. Just gonna line up my needle so it's nicely on the edge there. Ta-da! Okay, so as you can see, now we have a perfectly hemmed circle skirt. It looks really nice. And we'll be ready to start gathering and attaching it to our bodice. Okay, so we've got our ruffle piece that is hemmed, and we have our circle skirt that we assembled already. And now what we're going to do is we're going to match up the quarters, and then we are going to gather all the way around the skirt. So we're going to gather the ruffle to fit the circumference of the bottom of the skirt. And I will probably fast forward through this entire process, but you can still watch what I do. So the one thing that I wanted to explain first is because we have this pocket, we're going to need to do like a flip when we're sewing and stuff. So do not pin to the pocket at all. You can pin to the seam allowance, but not to the actual pocket. And we're making sure that our fabrics are right sides together. We're also making sure that our ruffle piece is not twisted anywhere. Okay, so from one side, we're going to find our bobbin threads. And we're going to start gathering our ruffle. I'm just sliding the fabric from my ruffle along my bobbin threads. So I'm holding my bobbin threads nice and tight with this hand, and I'm sliding the fabric along with my other hand. And voila! We have our ruffle all pinned to our skirt. I want to remind you not to pin into your pocket because we're going to be flipping that out of the way when we sew our ruffle on. So I will meet you at the machine. Okay, so we now have our ruffle pinned to our circle skirt. And I'm going to start at one of the edges where we have the pocket sticking out. I'm going to start right in that seam right there. Make sure you're not stitching into your pocket. You can stitch over the seam allowance of your pocket, but not into your pocket. So I'm putting my needle down right in the ditch there at a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to use a stitch length of 2. Okay, so when we get to the pocket on the other side, we are going to sew right up very carefully right into that ditch of that pocket. So I'm just sewing through the seam allowance. Then I'm going to, first we need to back stitch. Then I'm going to flip it to the back so that it's out of the way. And I'm going to start again. Okay, so my pocket has already flipped, but it was this way, so we want to flip it out of the way so we are not sewing into our pocket and connect those stitches where we started. So here where we have the pocket, on both sides it should look like this. So that's one side, that's the other side. Okay, so you shouldn't have sewn through the pocket at all. Now we just need to finish our seams, our edges. So I'm going to use my serger. You can use a zigzag, you can do bias tape, whatever you're comfortable with. Just make sure these edges are finished because right now they are raw. Okay, so additionally I have pressed my ruffle seam allowance up toward the skirt, and you can top stitch that as well if you feel the need to. For big ruffles like this, I don't usually top stitch. Okay. Now all there's left to do is sew our gathering stitches around the waist. He's just learning to make sounds. Okay, so I like to start at one side of my placket and go all the way around the waist to the other side of the placket. And you want to make sure, for starters, you can trim off the excess placket at the top of the waist here. You want to make sure that you're not sewing through your placket. So here's my placket. I'm going to start sewing here and go all the way around the waist, and I'm going to finish here before the end of my other placket. So again, I'm going to do 2 long gathering stitches. So I'm going to do one at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance and one at 3/4, and I'm going to use a stitch length of 4. Okay, no back stitching for gathering stitch. And we'll do our second one. Okay, so I have done my gathering stitches. It looks like this all the way around. And we can now start attaching it to our bodice. Okay, so now that our skirts are totally complete, we're going to attach it to the bodice. So if you are not going to enclose your waist seam, you can simply sew your gathered skirt to your bodice. Fit the gathering to the bodice, and then finish your seams with a serger or a zigzag stitch, as I've done with this dress, and then press the seam allowance up toward the bodice, and you can top stitch it just like that, and you'll have almost a full complete dress that looks something like this. If, however, you want to enclose your waist seam, I am going to be doing that now. So, what I like to do first is pin my side seams to the side seams on my bodice. So I'm going to untie my ties just so that I can make sure that they're staying out of the way. And we are going to pin only to our main, not to our lining. So I've separated my main and lining at the side seam, and I'm going to pin my main side seam to my skirt side seam. I'm going to put in a couple pins just so that I can make sure my seam allowance is staying open on my bodice, limiting the amount of bulk. Okay, now I'll take the other side seam on my main. Untying my ties so they stay out of the way. And I'm going to pin that to the other side seam on my dress. Okay, and now I go and pin the back edges of my bodice up with the very edge of my placket. Making sure to line up those edges perfectly. And we're only pinning the main, not the lining as well, just the main bodice piece. Tuck that lining out of the way. Okay. Now the other back bodice piece. And pull that around the skirt. And this placket is the one that's folded to the back, this side of the placket. And I have it pinned there in place. And again, I'm going to line up those edges really nicely and stick a pin in just my main fabric, not my lining. Okay, so on this side, it looks like this. I'm lining up the edge of my placket here with the edge of my back bodice. They're perfectly lined up, and I'm pinning it only to my main. Okay, so now we just gather the skirt to fit the bodice. Okay, and then I'm just going to pin it as I go here. So I've gathered my skirt from one side of the back bodice all the way to the front center, and then I'll do the same on the other side. That's the easiest way I've found to do it. If you have a better way, feel free. So when you're pinning to your bodice, make sure your flutters are going in the correct direction, because if you sew them going in the wrong direction, your flutters will fold in instead of staying nice and flat out. Okay, I'm gonna throw one more pin in there, I think, and then we'll do the other side. Okay, so that's what the one side looks like when it's done. Now I'm going to start on the other side. So I'm going to the other side of the back bodice, and I'm finding my bobbin threads again. And I'm just going to slide the fabric along my bobbin threads. I have my skirt pinned to only the main of my bodice. You can see my lining is all loosey-goosey out here. So before I start sewing, I like to just double check and make sure that my ties are all definitely out of the way. They're not pinned in, they're not sticking up or sticking out anywhere. Make sure they're all out of the way. And make sure that all of my pins are pinned only to my main fabric. So then I sew with my ruffles up, and I pull, when I start at the back bodice, I pull my lining out flat like this, and I start right where that seam is, on the back seam here, where my lining and my main line up at the very back. And so I start right here and I sew all the way around the skirt, and then I stop again, pulling my fabric up out of the way. I stop when I get to the very end there. So I'm using a stitch length of 2 and a seam allowance of 3/8. Okay, so I have my lining pulled out of the way. Let's see if I turn this off, if you can see. I have my lining pulled out of the way, and I'm just sewing to the right to the edge there, where it attaches to the main. Perfect. Okay, so now what we're going to do is tuck our seam allowance up. You can trim all your threads. Okay, so start at one end, back bodice, tuck your seam allowance up inside, and fold your lining down over top. You're going to want to cover the stitches that you made sewing the skirt onto the bodice. I'll show you what it looks like in a second here. So get it all lined up. Okay, so here at the back edge of my bodice, I have my seam allowance tucked up inside here. It's back in here, and I have folded my lining down over top of the stitches that I made. And I'm going to do that on the other side as well. Okay, and we're going to just line up all of our seams. So I'm going to do that same thing. I'm going to tuck the seam allowance. I'm going to tuck the seam allowance up on the bodice side seam. I'm going to tuck it up, and I'm going to pull this one down, fold it under the same amount of as your seam allowance, so 1/8 of an inch, and cover up those seams that you sewed. And you're just going to fold it all the way along, take it over to your iron and press. So now I have my lining all pressed. I'm going to take some steam seam, and I'm going to just do little bits at a time. I find that a lot easier. And what we're going to do is stick that in between our folded up lining and our seam allowance from sewing the skirt. So stick it right along in here. Fold the lining over to meet that stitch line. And little by little, we're going to sew that in there. Make sure it worked. You give that a good press. That looks good. We're going to do this all the way to the other back bodice. The inside of your bodice should look pretty neat and clean like that. And then we're going to turn it over and we're going to top stitch along our seam allowance here at the bottom of the bodice all the way along. Oh, there's a tuck there. It acts as glue in between the layers, so if you get a little tuck like that, you can just pull it apart a little bit. The top stitching will help. Make sure there's no other little spots. Okay, So now we're just going to go along and we're going to top stitch. Make sure you don't top stitch your ties in, and make sure your flutters are going in the right direction when you're top stitching. Okay, so we're going to use a top stitch length of 3. And we're going to start at one side of the back bodice and work our way all the way around with a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Okay, so once you have top stitched it, it'll look like this from the outside. Hopefully really nice and straight along the edge of your bodice there. And on the inside, you should have caught the lining all the way along. It doesn't have to look pretty. Some areas it's wider than others, but the lining should have caught all the way around. Okay, so now we have almost a completed dress. All we have left to do are buttons or snaps. Okay, so now we are going to be working on our buttonholes. Everybody's machine is different. I'm using my embroidery sewing machine combo for my buttonholes. I lost my buttonhole foot from my other machine, and this foot, though it fits on the other machine, it doesn't quite work the way it's supposed to. So I'm going to use this machine to show you, but it is a little bit different. I've done some practice ones, and I highly recommend you do the same to make sure that you have the stitch width that you want, or stitch length, sorry, the stitch length that you want for your buttonholes. I like a really small stitch length for buttonholes. I feel like they hold longer and are a little bit more secure and nicer looking. So I'm going to use the traditional square buttonhole, so just like these ones here. Here we go. They're just rectangles. And the reason I like to use those is because they're easy to line up on your marked spots on your dress. So as you can see here, I have clipped the back pieces together where they line up. So you want that placket to be, you know, totally covered here and have the same overlap all the way up. And I've marked here on the edge where I want my buttons to go. So there's 3 marks there. I've just used a friction pen. So there's one here, one in the middle, and one down lower. Usually I would do 4 buttons, but I only have 3 of the buttons that I want to use for this dress, so we are going with 3 for today. So I've marked here, here, and here where I want the buttonholes to go. And yeah, so now I'm just going to, I need to put my buttonhole foot on my machine. This is a 1-step buttonhole. If you have more steps, it'll be kind of the same. There's tons of YouTube videos online, but it has this little lever here. It's usually up, and you need to pull that down, and on some machines you need to push it back. What else can I say? Stitch width should be at about a 5, and stitch length should be somewhere between 0 and 1. I do as close to 0 as I can get without it actually being 0. So I'm at 0.2 right now for my stitch length. What else can I say? Make sure that when you do your buttonholes, you are on the back bodice piece that goes on the top. So your buttons are going to be on the one that goes on the bottom, and your buttonholes go on the top. Okay, so now we just have to line up our buttonhole marks. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to mark along the edge where I want them to start. So, I'm going to get my ruler, and I'm going to mark all the way down my bodice where I want the buttonholes to start. There, there, and there. Okay, so I've marked how far into the bodice that I want them to go, and I've measured all the way down to make sure that they start with the right seam allowance there. And then when we line up our bodice, a buttonhole foot always sews backwards. So we're going to line up our mark in the buttonhole foot there. Put our presser foot down, make sure everything else is out of the way. Oh, you know what we need to do is put a button in our buttonhole foot. So, hang on, I will show you what I mean. So this is what a buttonhole foot looks like. It won't focus. Anyway, on one end you have a spot where you put the button. So I have these little tiny buttons for my little tiny dress, and we just squeeze it in there so that it just fits. Okay, so I just put my button in there. Make sure it's not going to fall out. Put our presser foot on. Make sure your lever is down and pushed back. Line up your mark and make sure it's going straight across the bodice. Okay, and then I'm just going to go ahead and sew. You can go as fast or as slow as you are comfortable with. Okay, so you'll have something that looks like that. Mine's teeny tiny. And I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing for the next buttonhole, making sure everything is nice and straight. That one came out bigger for some reason. Now we just need to do our last one. You may have more to do than I do. I'm just going to do 3 on camera to show you that it's not as scary as you might think. Okay, I've got my 3 buttonholes here, and I'm going to trim my threads, and I'm going to go and press. And when I press, those marks that I made will be erased. Okay, so I'm just going to press that and then I'll show you how to rip them open. Okay, so I've repressed my buttonholes and now I'm going to take some pins and I'm going to pin through right where the buttonhole ends. Just like this. Then when I take my seam ripper, this is just like a cheap little one from Amazon. When I take my seam ripper, I'm going to seam rip toward that pin, and the pin's going to help you stop your seam ripper before it gets to the end of the buttonhole, so you don't have your bodice ripped open. Okay, so there is our first buttonhole. We'll do the other ones. Right at the end. Okay, second buttonhole is done. Three buttonholes done. And there you have it. You've got all three buttonholes ready to go. Okay, so the next thing I like to do is I like to make sure that it's all lined up the way that I want it to be. That placket is covered and you're overlapping about the same amount all the way up the bodice. Like that, I'm going to clip it in place. And I'm going to put a pin down here where the placket is, just to hold that together temporarily. And now I'm going to mark where I want my buttons to go. So I'm going to take my friction pen. You can find these at pretty much any craft store, I think. They are friction pilot pens, you can see there. So I'm just going to take that and I'm going to mark through my buttonholes onto the other side of the back bodice, and that will show me where I need my buttons to go. So I just stick my pen through and do a line. Then I like to peek and make sure that they look like they're about in the right spots, which they do. So I have 1, 2, 3 here. I can take out my pin and now we can sew on our buttons. So now we're going to sew on our buttons, and for that I like to use hand quilting thread. It looks like this. There we go. It's hand quilting thread. It's a little bit thicker and sturdier than the regular cotton thread. And I just take like a long length of it, maybe a foot or so. And a hand sewing needle. I have a little collection here. Okay, so I'm just threading my needle. There we go, and I pull the needle down halfway, so I match up the ends of my thread. And I make a knot in my thread. Okay, and I leave a tail long enough that I'll be able to tie it off in the end. So I have about 1 inch, maybe a little bit more, of thread so that I can tie it off in the end. Then I position my buttons on my marks. And I start from the back. Okay, so I've pulled it through from the back, making sure that it's on the mark there. And down on the opposite hole. Okay, so you can see maybe if it will focus. I've done a cross, and now I'm going to do that a few more times, and then I'll do the up and down holes. You can pull it tight, but not too tight. You don't want it to pucker in the back. Okay, one more time for the across ones. Okay, now I'm going to come up through the top hole. And down through the bottom. Do that a few times. And one more time. Okay, so it will look something like that. I wish it would focus a little bit better. This is a new camera to me, so I'm still figuring it out, but it looks something like that. And on the back, it looks something like this. Now I'm just going to clip off my thread, my needle. So there's my needle. I'm just going to set that down at the side. And I'm going to take my tail from when I tied the knot in my thread, and I'm going to tie it to those ends that I just finished with. I'm going to do a nice strong double or triple knot. You can do a surgeon's knot, which is going through 1, 2, 3 times. Oops. Okay, now we just trim our threads. You have a nice strong button. Just test that your buttonhole works with your button and that your bodice is still lined up where you want it. And that's looking just right. Okay, so you're going to do that the same with all 3 buttons, and you'll have a dress. Okay, so with the other dress, I'm going to show you how to do snaps with a table press or a hand press. If you have a hand press, you can easily do that as well. I have ring snaps from snapstool.com. I have tons of them, so I use them quite often. So again, I'm just going to line my bodice up so that it overlaps the same amount the whole way up the bodice. And I'm going to clip it at the top. Make sure the bottom of your bodices line up. And then I don't have a spacer like some people do, so I just kind of eyeball it. I'm going to probably do 4 or 5 snaps. I like to do one really nice and high up that keeps the bodice closed. About there. And I like to do one way down at the bottom, right before those seam allowances overlap. And then I'll just eyeball the rest. So I'll probably do 3 more. So I'll do 1 kind of right in the middle, and then 2 in the middle of those, like that. And I just play with them until they look like they're evenly spaced. Sometimes I use my measuring device to make sure they're evenly spaced, but so long as they look good, I am happy. Okay, and then I go and use my friction pen and I mark that. And I will use a ruler to make sure that they are the same amount away from the bodice edge all the way up. In this case, they are pretty good, so I'm happy with that. Okay, so on the left side of the bodice that goes on top of the other side, I like to use the open female snaps. So you have female ones that look like this. They're called female, don't judge me, it's just what they're called. And then you have the male part of the snap, which is this one. It has the nose on it. So for these ones on the left side of the bodice, we're going to use our females. So this is what it looks like right side up. Hopefully you can tell the difference. This is what it looks like wrong side up. So it has a bit of a lip on the wrong side, and on the right side it does not. So right side up, we're going to put it inside of our table press and just put it nice and snug in there. And we're going to put one of our claspy pieces, these pokey guys. I really wish this would focus closer. These pokey guys we're going to put on our table press like this on the bottom. And then right side down, you're going to match up that mark on your table press. Can't really see what I'm doing here. Okay, and we're just going to press that down. And you'll get something that looks like that. One of my little prongs are sticking out this side though, so I'm going to have to do that one again. Anyway, we'll keep going. You're going to do that all the way down with those female snaps. Okay, so I have all 5 of my snaps here. There we go. And now what I do is I overlap those bodices again. So that they're the same all the way up. Put in my clip. And a pin at the bottom to make sure those don't move. Then I go to the inside and I feel through the fabric where my snaps are and I mark right in the middle. Making sure that those bodice pieces overlap the same amount all the way up. Okay. Now I take my clip and my pin out. And for this one, the male pieces are going to go on the right side of your fabric. So we're going to load up the table press again. And with the male snaps, we're going to load them into the top of our table press. And we're going to put the nose up. These ones I find a little more tricky than the other ones. Okay, so instead of face down like this, we're going to have our fabric right side up. And we're going to match those marks again. I like to give it a little jiggle and then press. It's hard to press them sitting down. That one worked out pretty well. Reload, and do that all the way down. Oops. See, this one has a prong sticking out wrong from the snap down at the bottom here. So I'm going to take that one out and try it again. And to do that, you have to very carefully, I just use a flathead screwdriver and I very carefully pry it from the prongs on the back without ripping my fabric, which is sometimes a little difficult. Okay, then I have to bend these back in so they don't rip my fabric when I pull out the back prongs. Okay, so we'll try that again. Reload. Now we have all of our snaps done. We can snap them up to make sure that they are sitting properly on the dress. Okay, the last thing we have to do is to make the pocket bows. I prefer not to have the bows on my dress. I find them to be a little bit bulky for my girls who are very active. So instead, I put a hair tie on mine, or a clip, and I make little hair ties to match their dresses. So I've already finished that one, and I'm going to show you how to do it with this one. So the first thing we need to do is to take our two bow pieces, put them right sides together, and we are going to sew, leaving a 1-inch gap at the top or the bottom, So we're gonna sew around, down this way, and stop here about an inch before we get back to where we started. And we're going to use a seam allowance of 1/4 of an inch. The needle's not in the right position. Try that again. Okay, so there you go. I've sewn it all the way around, leaving a 1-inch gap there. I wish it would focus. Okay, so now we need to clip our curves. Clip our corners, I should say. And we're going to turn this out. And we're going to press that flat. Okay, so now for the bow tail, what you're going to do is you're going to take your tail piece and you're going to fold it in half lengthwise and press. And then with the raw edge at the top, you're going to fold in the corners so that the side matches the bottom. So there's a 45-degree angle there. And that's going to be your mark where you're sewing down into the corners. So we're going to start here-ish. We're going to sew over and down on that fold, and then we're going to leave a gap here, and we're going to sew this way and down on that fold. Be sure to backstitch when you get down to those corners. Okay, so we're leaving a 1-inch gap between where we start and where we started on the last one. Okay, so it'll look something like that when done. Now we're going to trim off those extra fabric at the corners. Clip your curves or your corners. Trim your threads. Turn it out. And you're going to press that flat. Next we have our bow center, so again we're going to fold it lengthwise this way, and we're going to sew down the length with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And now we're going to turn this out. And we're going to press that flat with the seam at the back, like this. You can see the seam in the middle there. Okay, once you have all of your pieces pressed flat, we can put them all together. So this is your bow piece, and I'm just going to fold it like an accordion. Something like that. And I'm going to do the same with my bow tails. Right underneath my bow. So I'm doing it like this, holding it like an accordion. Okay, So I'm pinching it like this. Then we're going to take the bow tail and we're going to place it toward the bow with right sides together. Bring it around back. I think the pattern suggests to cut this down to like 3 inches and a quarter or something, but I find it easier to actually sew with the length of the bow center, so I'm just going to go ahead and do that. Stitch length of 2. We're going to sew right across that bow center. I went across it a couple times just to make sure that it's nice and secured. Trimming my threads with my dull scissors. There we go. Now we can cut the excess off. So now you can see the seam right here, so we're going to flip that so that it's right side out. So the seam will be now touching the bow. There we go. Fix our bow tail and our bow so that they look nice, and you can secure that with, if you want to hand sew it to secure it, you can do it with super glue, whatever you like. And there you have it. A beautiful bow. So you may have noticed that I actually decided to put both of the last 2 days together into one video. It's a kind of a long day, but it is definitely doable. And if you don't find that it's doable, because you're a busy human like me, you can always divide it into 2 days yourself. So this video I think ended up being almost 2 hours long. But it may or may not take you that long because I went over a whole bunch of different options that you may or may not be adding to your dress. So give it a shot, and if you do it all in one day, good for you. You'll notice I did it in 2 days because I'm a busy mom, and that's just the way it goes. So I hope you enjoyed the Betty sew along, and I can't wait to do another one. Thanks for joining me.